Right. Hi, my name is Gabriel Alexander Miliaccio. My ID number is 835001910. This is my submission for the economics project. Submission due April 3rd, 2025. My portion of the project was the factors influencing the PAE curve and the inflationary and recessionary gaps. So, to begin, movement along the planned aggregate expenditure curve, or the PAE curve, occurs when non-income factors are held constant. A shift of the PAE curve occurs when there is a change in a non-income factor. This is shown right here, where there's a graph that says movement along the PAE, where you move from point A to point B. This is whenever this graph, for example, shows an increase in income. There is nothing else changed here. Inflation, general wealth, taxes, all of those things still remain the same, so it's a movement along the PAE. Down below, where it says shift of the PAE, this is an example of when taxes lessen or when wealth increases, something that is non-income determinant that changes, which is why the PAE curve moves from point A1 to point A2. As you can see by this arrow that is held constant, the actual income has not changed. It's just an income determinant that has. Moving on, one thing to think about as we move along is, would an increase in the restrictions of trade cause a shift left or right of the PAE? As you all know, PAE is congruent with Y, and Y, in this case GDP, is congruent with consumer spending, government spending, investment, and net exports. So, an increase in the restrictions of trade would cause a shift left of the PAE curve and cause the PAE curve to decrease. This is because restrictions on trade would cause net exports to decrease even further because people wouldn't import or export anything, and it would cause the overall GDP to go down. So it would shift the curve left. Income determinants are any change in overall domestic income, but those are income only. And then for review, what is the difference of PAE and AE? The main difference is that planned aggregate expenditure refers to the total planning spending on goods and services, while AE represents the total actual spending in the economy, which can include unplanned inventory investment. Essentially, planned versus non-planned is that planned is what people believe is going to happen, and AE is what actually ends up happening. This next section is a graph which shows which factors would cause what sort of shift or movement along the curve of the PAE. The only factor that would cause a movement along the curve is a direct change to current domestic income. As you can see in this red box here, this is domestic income. This is the only box in the entire table that causes a shift along the curve. All of the rest of these cause shifts of the entire curve. It's the difference between this point here on the graph moving to this point here, or this curve here moving to this curve over here, which is pretty important to note. Just for a quick example, domestic income increases. So because domestic income increases, more people decide to buy things like consumer goods, so consumer goes up, and more people decide to import goods instead of exporting, which actually ends up decreasing net exports. And so as an overall effect, it generally increases GDP, and that would look something like this. You have your normal PAE curve, you have your first point here, and because domestic income increases, it just moves along to this point here. So it just moves directly along because it's an income determinant. However, for something like expected future income, where people believe that they're going to make more money eventually, the actual GDP doesn't change, but their assumption of what it will be does, which means that the PAE curve, number one here, actually ends up changing and increasing to this PAE curve, number two. Now, on to inflationary and recessionary gaps. So, full employment occurs when there is no cyclical unemployment in an economy. Remember, cyclical unemployment exists due to fluctuations in the business cycle, such as economic downturns or economic booms. So, recessionary gaps. A recessionary output gap occurs when the equilibrium aggregate expenditure is below the assumed full employment. And then, an inflationary output gap occurs when the equilibrium aggregate expenditure is above the assumed full employment. Graphically, both of these gaps are represented by the distance between y and FE. That is extremely important. So, on this graph here, this one for reference, the Keynesian equilibrium is at this point, the point I've marked. However, the equilibrium that actually is noted is this one down here, where PAE2 is equal to the standard 45-degree PAE curve. So obviously, as you can see, there's a difference between this y and this YFE, and this little box right here is that recessionary gap. On the contrary, in the other graph, this one over here, the Keynesian equilibrium is actually lower than the actual equilibrium, meaning that the inflationary gap is right here. As mentioned previously, the difference and the way that you would measure such gaps is the difference between y and YFE, and for this case, YFE and y. So, why cyclical unemployment exists even when there's full employment? So this is kind of a trick question. Cyclical unemployment does not exist when assuming there is full employment. However, there's always a natural amount of unemployment present. For full employment to be assumed, there is no cyclical unemployment, because cyclical unemployment is the idea that there is a recession or recessionary gap or inflationary gap causing unemployment, and full employment assumes that we're not currently in a recession or in an economic boom. Finally, a recent increase in the severity of safety regulations increases cyclical unemployment. So, what would this look like? Safety regulations, a lot of companies don't want to have issues with regulations making workers more expensive, so they start to lay off a lot of different workers, and that ends up increasing cyclical unemployment. So, because there is a massive increase in cyclical unemployment, you know that we're starting to near a recession. So, on a graph, you have your standard PAE curve, which is a 45-degree angle. And you have your PAE1, which is where you're supposed to be, up here. I will mark the Keynesian equilibrium of that in black. However, your actual Keynesian equilibrium ends up being somewhere around here. And that is because your PAE curve number 2 is actually right around here. Now, again, the way you would measure the difference between the two is you would check your y, which is going to be here, and you would check your YFE, which is going to be right over here, just by using these little dots right here. So, as said previously, the way that you would measure any sort of these gaps is this square right here. And that is it.